Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for MDR's webinar. As you see there, Expert View, What's Next with Funding and Common Core. So we're very pleased to be able to bring you insight from our experts on the always important topic of education funding, including both the federal outlook in this era of sequestration and continuing resolutions, and also look at how state funding is faring. And state and federal funding together make up over half of most districts' funding, so it's important to look at both levels. We will then explore what's assuredly the most talked about topic in K-12 education today, the Common Core state standards and new assessments. The two topics are obviously linked as new initiatives take funding to implement, and funding is in part at least determined by and greatly influenced by new initiatives as they're planned and introduced and rolled out. We have a lot of information to cover today, but I do want to give you just a couple of quick reminders. All of these sessions are recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available to you by tomorrow. We will allow time for questions and answers at the end of the session, but you can submit a question at any time during the discussion, again using that question and answer tool in the lower corner of your screen. We will go through as many questions as possible during the session, but we'll also follow up with answers to all the questions we do receive in the next couple of days, and we'll post those on the MDR website, schooldata.com. We'll also alert you by email when all these things are available to you. So we've got a lot of content packed into this hour, and I want to first start by introducing our experts. First, we have Ann Wujcik, MDR Senior Education Research Analyst, who's going to kick things off for us today. Ann is well known to many of you through her work on our EdNet services, delivering forward-thinking marketing insight annually at the EdNet conference, coming up in September in Denver this year, and also serving as the managing editor of our free weekly EdNet News Alert newsletter. Ann is also a key provider of our EdNet Insight service, providing research and information to help businesses with decision support services. Ann is our in-house expert on funding, and we love to listen to her insight. So thanks for being here today, Ann. And our next guest speaker, Dr. Geoff Fletcher. He serves as SETDA's Deputy Executive Director. And prior to joining SETDA, Geoff was Editorial Director for the Education Group of 1105 Media, Inc., with responsibility for all content of the Education Group, including THE Journal, Campus Technology, and their websites and e-newsletters. He also served with the Texas Education Agency for 11 years in various positions, including Assistant Commissioner with responsibility for standards and curriculum, the statewide assessment program, educational technology initiatives, textbooks, and professional development. Geoff has contributed to EdNet discussions in the past and also participated in EdNet Insight events, and we're very happy to have him here joining us today as well. So welcome, Geoff. Okay. Thought we'd start off by just sharing some research with you, pretty current and relevant to today's discussion. And we know from the research conducted by MDR's EdNet Insight service in 2012 that the number one top priority for districts over the next 3 years is modifying curriculum instruction to meet Common Core state standards, with 82% of the curriculum directors giving it a high priority on a high, medium, and low scale. And that's very closely followed by the number two priority, as you see there, modifying assessments to prepare for Common Core. 76% of the curriculum directors gave that a high priority rating. And just to kind of frame it for you, the third priority you see there was implementing more STEM programs, but with only 37% of the respondents giving that a high priority. Common Core state standards and the new assessments are very clearly and not surprisingly top of mind for districts. And priorities, of course, drive action. And when we asked the curriculum directors what they expected, where and how they expected to find materials to address the Common Core, you can see that 3/4 of the curriculum directors indicated that they would seek out free materials from the consortia, and nearly 2/3 said that they would create new materials, and that primarily would happen in larger districts who have the bandwidth and resources to typically do that. And good news for some of our listeners today is that nearly 2/3, 62%, said they do plan to purchase new materials. So now I want to turn it over. I want to first of all say that, Ann and Geoff have a lot of great information. We're going to start with Ann, so I'm going to turn it over to Ann to speak more about funding.
Thank you, Kathleen. I obviously have the Common Core assessments on the brain. So if you look at this sentence, or if you use this sentence to describe federal fiscal policy and its impact, there are a lot of words that could fill in the blank. The most obvious of which are the sky is falling or the sky isn't falling. The problem is that for some time now, any given day or week, you could go back and forth between those two choices with dizzying speed and to be accurate. But things seem to have calmed down a bit, and what I hope to do today is to catch you up a little bit on what's current at the federal level, and then make the argument that in reality we should be more concerned right now about state and local level. Okay, so after talking about this for more than a year, we are now living in the post-sequester world. And the good news is that the onset of the sequester on March 1 did not cause the U.S. economy to implode. It's not good news that we're in this mess, but we seem to be muddling forward. You'll remember that the sequester was enacted in the Budget Control Act as a poison pill. It was the remedy too awful to consider, and it was meant to motivate Congress to reach a long-term deficit solution. They never could do that. They tried back in November 2011. They threw up their hands and gave up, and that set us up for a January 2nd, 2013 as the start date for an across-the-board reduction to all fiscal year 2013 discretionary spending. And at that point in time, it was expected that those cuts would be someplace in the 7.5% to 9% range. However, after the 2012 election, Congress and the administration tried again, and they didn't get very far, but they did pass an amendment to the Budget Control Act that pushed sequestration back to March 1 and reduced the fiscal 13 cuts to $85 billion. Supposedly those cuts they're scheduled to be $109.3 billion annually. So they cut $24 billion out of the cuts. Now that means that right now all appropriated federal programs are subject to a 5.1% reduction of their 2013 budgets, the one they're operating under right now. Now, the good news is that since so many education programs are forward funded, most schools won't feel those cuts until next school year. The exception is programs that receive impact aid funding, and they're being hit right now. But they knew this was coming, and they've planned for the cuts as much as they could, though in some places, those, especially those serving Native American populations, the cuts are just devastating. There's about 1,300 school districts nationwide that receive impact aid, and that's for schools that can't collect local property taxes because they're either located on an American Indian reservation or on a military base. Now, for some of those schools, federal dollars make up as much as 30% of their budgets. So even a 5% cut, which is relatively small, is a devastating cut. All right. Now, meanwhile, with the sequester behind us, Congress decided, I think, to save its full-fledged budget debate for when they consider the FY2014 budget, and to fund the rest of this current fiscal year by extending the continuing resolution, which was originally set to expire today. Now remember that a continuing resolution means that everything is held at the previous year's budget level. So the schools had essentially the same funding this year as they did for last year, which is basically good news. They didn't experience a cut, at least in funding levels. The bad news is that Congress let the sequester stand, especially for education. There had been some hope that when they went in to look at the continuing resolution, they would modify the sequester. And as you can see on this slide, they did give some flexibility to certain departments: agriculture, Commerce, Justice, Science, Homeland Security, Defense, and Veterans Affairs. But when Senator Harkin attempted to get the same flexibility for the Education Department, that amendment failed. I'm not sure what message that sends, but perhaps they'd done as much as they were capable of doing. Anyway, the House passed the CR on March 7th. It went to the Senate. They debated, passed it on the 21st. You notice that they passed it at the 1.04 trillion level. That's the cap for spending this year under the Budget Control Act. They were a little more generous than the House. And then it went back to the House. They passed the Senate amended version on March 21st without much fighting about it. And my understanding, I think the President signed it yesterday. So we are now operating through the end of June, the next 6 months, through the end. The fiscal Fed year is October 1, so through the end of September under this continuing resolution. All right, so that's where we are on that. All right, come on. I put this in here just to remind you of the FY 2012 levels of federal funding, because those are the levels that have been and now will continue to be in place for the rest of fiscal 13 as well. And these are the numbers to which the 5.1% across the board cuts will be applied. Now, there's another message in this graph, and that's the fact that if you look at 2011, 2012, and even the budgets, the President's 2013 request, which never even got, it didn't even merit any debate because we weren't going any place with it, you'll see that there has been very little change in the amount of money appropriated for federal education. And if you discount the stimulus money in 2009, this has been true for the past 5 years. So essentially, the federal education budget has been growing at a very slow and small rate. And that seems to be the nature of the new economy that we're in. It also means that if you want to put a lot of money into a existing program or a new program with this limited budget, that money is going to have to come out of someplace else. And that's why people objected so strongly to the across-the-board cuts. But we're going to struggle with this moving forward. Okay. Now, here are the cuts under sequestration. Title I, which is the biggest program, will be cut by about $726 million. And you can see the other cuts on here, IDEA, the teacher quality programs, the higher ed programs, career technical education, depending on the size, this is the 5%. Head Start's going to be cut by $398 million. Now, Head Start's not actually in the education budget, but it is considered an education program. And the Senate did something really interesting. When the Senate debated its continuing resolution, they added $50 million to the Child Care and Development Block Grants, so that provides child care for the children of the working poor, and $33.5 million to Head Start, which is why that asterisk is down there. Now, $33.5 million isn't going to do a lot to backfill that $398 million that Head Start's planning to lose. I think what's instructive about the fact that Congress added money in these programs was it speaks to the popularity of preschool and child care funding. It's also worth noting that Title I allows a 15% annual carryover. So every year, Title I programs are allowed to take 15% of their budget and save it for the next budget year. Now, according to Charles Blaschke at Education Turnkey Systems, and many of you guys know Charles, he's forgotten more about Title I than I ever knew, there's a tremendous backlog of carried over money from waivers that the Department of Education granted over the past 2 years when districts were finding it hard to spend all of their stimulus dollars. So some districts were allowed to carry forward as much as 40% of their budget. Now, with 15% the limit this year, that means there's a really big pot of Title I money that hopefully will begin to reach the market now that everybody knows exactly where we stand. They can't carry most of it over. So we should see, hopefully, a significant increase in Title I purchasing between now and the end of the fiscal year. So that's the good news coming out of these manipulations. What are the next steps? Well, now that we're finally through with 2013, 6 months into the budget year, it looks like we're moving back to regular order, which means that we're going to pass budget resolutions, debate budgets, pass them in the individual houses, and then agree in conference on what the final budget will be. At least that's the way it looks right now. We are still operating under the Budget Control Act, however. So the cap for 2014 under that act is $1.066 trillion, and there will be $109.3 billion in sequester cuts that have to be made. The good news is rather than this MeatX approach of across the board, those cuts are supposed to be built into the appropriation, giving the department, Congress, and the president more flexibility. So you could imagine that the department might say, and Congress might agree, that no special ed funds would be cut. So though you still have to take the whatever the percentage is, it looks like it'll be about 7% next year, out of the education budget. Perhaps they take all of that out of Title I, which appears to be having trouble spending all the money that it has stored up over the while. That's speculative, but that's what it means. The other problem with this is that the House and Senate still take very different approaches to the budget. And to shorthand it in a way that may be simplistic but is relatively accurate, the House wants to reduce the size and reach of the federal government, and that includes reducing the amount of money that the federal government spends on certain activities. The Senate doesn't. I mean, it can be that bald a difference. So there is a lot of potential for conflict that remains. We could hear the same arguments coming on the 2014 budget that we've heard over the last several years. And then finally, when they debate the debt ceiling, because the debt ceiling has to be increased again, and that's sometime in either May or June, they may introduce new elements. They may revisit the sequester. It's not clear what they're going to do. So, though we're returning to normal order, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to get a budget. It hasn't been for years. Okay. Finally, people ask me about ESEA. And the fact of the matter is, I don't see reauthorization happening this year. It may happen sometime in 2014 if everything else stays settled and there's time to actually debate this bill. The fact of the matter is that waivers took a lot of the pressure off of the reauthorization push, though the states would still like to see ESEA reauthorized. We have 34 states approved for waivers and 11 states pending approval. So if all of those states get it, we'll be at 45 states that have a waiver, including Texas, which, though it didn't submit the typical waiver application, wasn't so far out of the box that the department rejected it out of hand the way it did California. So that's being debated right now between the department and the Texas Education Agency. Now, waivers, there's no new money associated with waivers, but remember that the 20% that they had to set aside for choice and for supplemental educational services is freed up. So that's a little bit of money, not new money, but money that can be spent in new ways as long as the focus remains on the lowest performing schools. And then finally, one other federal level thing. This isn't really budget, this is E-rate. And we put it in here, it's very early in the process. So this is here just because it's something you should continue to pay attention to. It's widely rumored that the Federal Communications Commission wants to do a major overhaul of the E-rate. And E-rate is the program that funds school connections to broadband, the Internet, as well as some internal school connections. The Commission is expected to release a notice of proposed rulemaking within the month, asking for comments on its plan, which could include plans to lift the E-rate cap by as much as $7 billion over the next 3 years. If that were to happen, that would effectively double the amount of E-rate funding available annually, which right now stands at about $2.4 billion a year. Now, E-rate dollars are not from the budget, but from a levy that the telcos, the telecommunication companies, pay into the E-rate fund. So to raise it by $7 billion would push up the percentage that the telcos have to contribute by a lot, possibly as much as a 30% contribution rate. That's not going to be an easy sell. So this is far from a done deal, but it's well worth watching, and it would be a big help on some of the things that Geoff is going to be talking to you about in terms of the Common Core assessments. The fact of the matter is that schools spend less of their own dollars on connections. That's money they could spend on content and services. Okay. Last few. Let's look at the state side of the equation. Remember that states supply about 45% of all public K-12 education funding, compared to the federal average share of 10%. Overall, we're seeing modest recovery in step with the slowly improving national economy, but it's uneven across states. 42 states this year managed to are spending more general fund money on education than they spent last year. And for the first time since 2008, 29 states expect their general fund revenues to surpass pre-recession levels. 2008 was the benchmark for that. That was the last year money looked good, and after that it's all been downhill. So that's good news. But general fund growth rate is slower this year than it was last year, so it makes people remain cautious. Only 8 states expect that they're going to have fiscal 2014 budget gaps. At the height of this economy recession, 42, 44, 45 states had budget gaps that they had to fix before they could even begin a fiscal year. But it is true that Sequester increases the burden for state budgets. States aren't going to be able to make up everything that the feds took out, but they're going to have to make up some of it. So, this is really slow, but hopefully it remains steady moving forward. The governors are really fans of education. They get it. I mean, education is important to the way a state economy functions. And most governors spoke rather extensively about education as a key element of their plans as they delivered their State of the State addresses in January and early February. Many governors followed through with budget proposals that include some level of increased funding for education programs, some of which I noted on this slide. The most encouraging data is this first data point about California. Now, California managed to pass a referendum that gave them an increase in taxes in the 2012 election cycle. And so the pressure has been off in California, and we're seeing that the number of California districts in financial jeopardy, I mean those that were ready to go into bankruptcy, has dropped by a third in the past year. So even California, which has been the most dysfunctional of our state finances, is coming back. You see Alabama's request of $405 million. New York hopes to get $889 million, though that's only a 4.4% increase. But the states are asking for more money. Now, it is entirely true that the governors and the chief state school officers aren't going to get everything they ask for. At the state level, legislators remember that budgets are a negotiation, and there are a lot of needs on the table. But it does seem likely that education funding will increase again in 2014 as it did in 2013. And any increases will be calculated this year on a base that grew by $5 billion last year. So for a change, the education pie isn't shrinking. So slowly we'll begin to see real recovery. And the states are where it's going to happen, guys, because there's not going to be a big new pot of federal dollars that happen. So what about priorities? Well, from the State of the Union address, you'll remember that the President, speaking for his own priorities in the Department, emphasized early childhood expansion with a proposal for universal preschool. That's a very expensive proposal, done in partnership with the states. There was a brief discussion about high school reform, and the President again addressed the STEM Master Teacher Corps, which he's been talking about for 2 or 3 years. We've never been able to get funding for it. It's an attempt to prepare teachers in the STEM area so that they are better prepared to get our kids up to speed. The governors in the states are totally focused on the Common Core state standards and the Common Core assessments. But the governors and the states also are big proponents of early childhood. So if we were to find a way to move forward, early childhood might be one of the areas that you would expect at least some money to be devoted to. The governors also care about STEM. With the new science standards coming down the line, they want to be sure their kids are well prepared. But much of the STEM money still comes out of private donations. I don't see a big push for STEM money. And we might see if the President's budget proposal, which is finally going to be delivered sometime in early April, as we understand it now, they may decide to use a little bit of the Race to the Top money this time around to fund a small pilot program about high school reform. So, it wouldn't be a lot of money, but it would lead the way. And that's where we are right now. And with this, I will pass this over to Geoff, who will proceed to talk about the next important elements in this, which is the Common Core related stuff.
Great. Thanks, Ann. So a quick word, if I can, about SETDA, and in case you don't know anything about the State Educational Technology Directors Association, we serve and we support the states in their efforts to improve education through technology, policy, and practice, and you see some of the reports that we've done there on the screen. So I've been asked to address three interlocking topics, the Common Core state standards and their status, the Race to the Top assessments and their status, and what's the latest in the content, digital content, and open educational resources arena. I'm going to try to scream through this in about 15 minutes so we have some time for questions and hopefully some answers. Since the adoption of the Common Core, there's been the question of will the standards themselves really stick? Will the state stay with them through these changes in the state, in leadership at the State Department of Education, the governor, or the legislative level? And there's been a lot of press lately that they won't hold. But what people are referring to, for the most part, is the Common Core assessments, where two states, Utah and Alabama, have dropped out of the assessments. But in fact, in regard to the standards, the Council of Chief State School Officers and NGA have taken great pains to be clear that the states themselves created these. They're not federal standards, yet the cry remains from some people that they're federal standards and that the feds are cramming these down their states' throats and that the federal government is taking over education and black helicopters are everywhere. In short, the Common Core, however, is holding tight in spite of the changes in leadership in many states. There are bills in legislatures, most prominently in Alabama and Indiana, to get out of the Common Core, but this doesn't seem to be widespread, and I've heard that these particular bills don't have a great chance of moving through the entire process. You never know for sure in state government, but it seems to be the Common Core, the standards themselves seem to be holding very well. So let's look now to Race to the Top assessment and how well districts and states are prepared. And I think we've got to look at this from a number of perspectives. The first is that the consortia have set an incredibly low bar for the technology necessary to run the test. For example, the biggie right now is that Windows XP is okay, even though support for it is going to stop on April 9th, 2014. That means no more security patches, no fixes, or anything from Microsoft. The consortia did this because 56% of the computers in the technology readiness tool, over 6 million devices, are Windows XP. And just a word about the technology readiness tool. This is a tool that developed under contract to both of the consortia, went out with an RFP at the same time. Pearson won that contract, and it's a tool that provides districts and the opportunity to load all kinds of information about their devices that are going to be used for assessment, their broadband capabilities and internet capabilities into this tool, and then measure that against the standards that the consortia have set. SETDA has done a lot of work with both the consortia and Pearson to help in the development and implementation of this tool. But what happened with Windows XP in general is that no one wanted to take responsibility to make people pay for the upgrades or any new technology. The consortia didn't. The states didn't have the money. The feds said they don't have the money, and so XP is going to be allowed. But I think another perspective to think about in terms of the extent to which school districts and states in general are going to be ready for assessment is a bit broader. And that is the number of students who can simultaneously access and complete the assessments. This depends on 5 interlocking factors, and so it includes the number of testing devices that students have access to, the incoming internet connectivity, the internal bandwidth, the size and the number of the test items, and then the testing window. So there's variability depending upon each of these factors and depending upon whether or not a school wants to devote all the devices in its building for assessment for a number of days at the same and hence shut down all instruction which may have had access to technology. So all these things interconnect and they variable and can change significantly. So we take a look at a deeper dive into some of this. Devices, a lot of people are focused on devices, and really, I don't think the school districts are in a bad place here with devices at all. The tech bar is low, and as noted earlier, and there is a significant testing window. For example, for Park, there's a 20-day testing window for both of their 2 different kinds of assessments. So that's a significant amount of time that people have to run kids through these assessments. The second thing that's a little bit knottier concern, and that's external and internal bandwidth. It's messy in that many school districts, particularly those in rural areas, are lacking bandwidth to the school. In looking at the data from the Technology Readiness tool, it seems like the bigger problem is internal to the school, the internal networks, not the bandwidth coming to the school. Districts need some help in analyzing this information. As I think a lot of us know, there are a huge number of factors that could affect the internal networks, including the age of the servers, the loading of different parts of the network, what devices they're using, the location of the hub in relation to the schools, where the testing is going to be done. But one key factor here that does concern the external bandwidth problem is that it can be a longer-term problem. You can fix the number of devices that you have with a big fat check, assuming you can get that check. But with bandwidth coming to the school, it may be a much more complicated issue to solve, and it could have a much longer time frame to actually solve it. A third area that's really important in readiness that some people are not paying attention to is tech support. This often gets overlooked, but having sufficient technology support and the ability to handle getting all the machines and the network ready for the test is no small task. And states and districts are moderately to extremely concerned about the level of their tech support, not the quality, but the quantity of their tech support in the schools. Finally, to me, the most important thing that school districts need to pay attention to in getting ready is professional development. And I don't mean training on how to use the online assessment programs. Those are going to be relatively easy. The hard part is going to be training teachers to teach the very different approach demanded by the Common Core. These are really different pedagogical models, and pile that on top with seamlessly integrating technology throughout instruction and solving complex problems that require internet research. That's a huge task. And if you've looked at the sample items that PARC and Smarter Balance have put up on their websites, you'll see that these are complex problems. They do require the use of technology in order for students to successfully complete them. Just a quick word about support for states and districts. There are a number of tools out there and capabilities to support states and districts that I think are worth noting. The first is the Technology Readiness tool, which I've mentioned. They are using this tool to gauge the extent to which they're going to be ready for online assessments, and it's helpful to them, but it's not really sufficient. PARC has released the PARC Assessment Administration Capacity Planning Tool, which is a mouthful. The intent here is to help schools and districts look at and manipulate the various factors that I spoke about earlier, those 5 different factors in terms of testing window and broadband and internet connectivity and so on. This is going to be really helpful to PARC states and schools and districts. And I understand that Smarter Balance has a similar device or kind of a readiness calculator of some kind, but it may be less complex. That has not been released yet. We at SETDA are doing 4 case studies that have of states that have implemented online assessments effectively, and we're looking at Delaware, North Carolina, Indiana, and Idaho. We're going to have a narrative of 3 to 5 pages and then include an online component that has sample checklists, communications with districts, professional development units and models, things to do on the day of the test, all those from those states that have successfully implemented online assessment in the past. And finally, you see there assessfored.net, which is a site we put up nearly 2 years ago that has information and resources as well as some community activities for some individual states and related issues. So all of those are there, but I don't think states and districts still need help in getting ready. Let me shift gears now to talk a little bit about the ongoing shift from print to digital in instructional materials and especially OER. And if you've read our report on the shift from print to digital that we called Out of Print, Reimagining the K-12 Textbook in a Digital Age, you know that at least 22 states have made significant changes in law or policy to encourage the shift from print to digital. And you can look at our State Education Policy Center and see the exact wording for these policies. It's a database that addresses 3 different areas, and the shift from print to digital is one of those areas and contains specific wording from state policies about that. But here are a few tidbits that show that this trend that we saw in 22 states and in a huge number of districts is accelerating. From the state perspective, we did cite North Carolina in out of print as a state that's making this shift. And about a week ago, you may have read that Governor McCrory signed 2 bills to that end. House Bill 44 set an overall goal to have the state shift to funding digital textbooks only and away from the paper-bound book by 2017. This is consistent with our recommendation in Out of Print that districts and states not adopt any more paper-based textbooks. We actually modeled our recommendation on one that a committee in North Carolina made to the governor, and that's pretty much what they came out with. The second bill, House Bill 23, requires new digital teaching and learning standards, and all teachers will have to demonstrate competency with technology in teaching and learning. Other states, such as Florida and Alabama, have significant digital initiatives and funding underway, although the Florida one is less money than originally expected for a variety of political reasons that we don't have time to cover now, other than the governor is in trouble and wants to spread the money to salaries instead. Alabama's original bill in the last session said that the intent was to have all digital content in the high schools, no paper. And by the way, you could use the money that's being proposed in this bill to buy the devices in order to use and display that digital content. Utah, we spotlighted in Out of Print because of its focus on open educational resources and their unique approach to developing content, especially in the science areas. And what they've done is they've created and distributed OER books at a small fraction. These are print books, but that's still a small fraction of the cost of textbooks, $5 per book that they printed through Amazon's self-publishing service, instead of the $80 for the regular textbooks. So Utah is being looked to by many as a model for at least a way to save money and still create some and use OER as a way to do that. Idaho, just about a week ago, Idaho started to reach out to other states, and they're planning to create their own open source digital textbooks. Some other factors, however, besides just the states moving forward, are pretty crucial in influencing this shift and in accelerating them. The first is, and to me the most important, is the business model. And more districts and states are realizing that we've got a problem with the business model of one book per student, per subject area, per grade level. It's just not flexible. And those people are saying that digital content is really software, and it should be sold as software is sold. It could be distributed in bundles with user agreements, and there could be tiered pricing levels that change based on the number of seats sold or other factors. And it also surround that with other kinds of services, such as training, support, and professional development. So the whole notion about business model, people are actually looking pretty seriously at that, both in the private sector as well as in the public sector. Another factor here that's influencing K-12 a good deal is higher education, especially community colleges. As you probably know, California passed legislation in September of 2012 to support the development of 50 open digital textbooks for introductory level classes taught at its incredibly huge university system. Washington and other states are calling for OER materials to be developed for the most commonly used courses. A very specific example of Tidewater Community College in Virginia is going to offer a textbook-free, what they call textbook-free program, and instead use OER. The changes that are going on here at the higher ed level are driven by cost, where textbook costs have increased more than 800% since 1978, and college students pay an average of $655 a year on books and supplies. Now, granted, higher ed is different from K-12 in that the customer for textbooks is the individual student and not the state or the district. But the approach that Tidewater is taking is similar to that that a district could take, or in some ways that Utah is taking. And all this is not going to happen without organizations or startups or companies to help move it along. And again, a lot of these companies are getting or have gotten their start in higher ed, but they're also moving to K-12. And I have CK-12 on here as a prime example. Their model is to break down content into relatively small granules that they call flexbooks that are smaller than chapters. And this granularity, in addition to their Creative Commons licensing, allows students and teachers the ability to customize the content and how they learn in what order and how to change, and they can change different components of those flexbooks and are encouraged to do that, to modify them to meet their needs. And then there's Amplify, which I think all of you know. It officially launched its device at South by Southwest EDU with a whole bunch of content on it already. And so that business model of a device with a whole bunch of content already on it is one which is one to watch. Another factor I'd like to bring in, and that is approaches to purchasing. You all know probably how Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii went together on a bid that was similar to past bids that Maine has done for its one-to-one program. And indeed, Hawaii is rolling out a one-to-one program over the next 3 years. So those 3 states were the lead. They created the RFP, and they judged the RFP. But 5 other states, Massachusetts, Montana, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and South Carolina, all are interested in participating with that contract, and the contract is structured in such a way that they indeed can participate. And I know other states are interested, looking at that very closely, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a few districts jump onto it. The contract is unique in not only because it was developed jointly among these states, but also because it's got a huge range of services it calls for. It calls for devices, including iPads and tablets and laptops. It calls for wireless services, professional development, support, guaranteed quick repair or replacement of devices. That's a pretty broad range of services and devices in order to ask for. And LA Unified, those of you who've looked at that contract, or that RFP, it's got a similar kind of a bid. So my point in including the main multi-state bid in the LA Unified and Amplify is that the content is no longer just textbooks. It's much wider, it's diverse, and content is no longer in isolation, and it can and will be part of devices, as we've seen in the consumer market with the Kindle. To state the obvious, the market is changing incredibly fast for education, and companies really need to be nimble and at least adjust to the market. But I think there's also an enormous opportunity to lead the market. And one thing that I'd like to propose, and we'll be happy to even lead the effort, is to get together some folks and create some alternative business models rather than waiting for those models to evolve. The market is becoming more and more flexible with the changes that we outlined in Out of Print, and I think now's the time to help shape what those business models can be to help schools and districts and to expand the market. So I'll stop there, and we'll see what we have in the way of questions.
Thank you, Geoff. We have received a couple of questions. So just up front, thank you for Geoff and Ann going over their content. They gave us an awful lot to think about and an awful lot to watch for. So, okay, let's go to the first question here. And Geoff, this is probably more for you. Given that we continue to hear from districts that one of their biggest concerns is finding instructional materials that are aligned to the Common Core, are there any regional groups that are attempting to vet instructional materials, so the districts don't have to do it one by one on their own?
Yes, Creative Commons and on the ISKME site, which is, I forget exactly what ISKME stands for. It's iskme.org, has a site that helps districts set up criteria to vet content. Creative Commons is helping with that. Achieve is helping with that as well. And Achieve has a rubric that they've created that's been very helpful to school districts. There also is a couple of movements out there technically to help that happen. You may have seen LRMI is out there for that AEP and Creative Commons have come together to create a pretty terrific project to create common standards for metadata for content to make it easier for school districts and teachers, et cetera, to find resources. And so there are additional technical and technology and data-related efforts that are happening out there. And by the way, one more plug, look for a paper from us coming in the next month that kind of tries to look at all these data initiatives and how they work together and explain all of those. I think there's it's a little bit tough right now, but I think there's movement both from the technical side as well as organizations like Creative Commons and Achieve trying to help school districts understand how to do this.
Great. Ann, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I must admit, and I think, Geoff, we've talked about this, I have been surprised that, that the momentum that was present in creating the standards didn't sort of continue into some kind of loose association where, Maine says, well, I'll look at Math K5 and I'll look at the, but other than the sites Geoff mentioned, I'm not aware of anybody doing this.
Well, there has been a little bit of noise, again, somewhere out of North Carolina and Maine, both, to say we'll develop these materials, kind of like in the community college level that I mentioned. We'll develop these materials, OER, for math. You develop another subject area because it's Common Core for everybody. So there's talk about that. I've not seen too many states. I haven't seen any states pick up on that, though.
It's hard work. Yeah, it is.
Time-consuming hard work. Okay, changing topics just a little bit. Somebody asked that they know the consortia has said that the tablets that meet the specifications will be acceptable testing devices, but are you hearing any concerns from the states about whether this will actually work?
Well, I've not heard concerns. I think there's some faith that the assessments are going to work, that the whole system is going to work. And remember, there are 33 states at least that are doing online assessment right now. It's automating paper and pencil multiple choice tests, but still 33 states doing online assessment right now. So I think the capability is there in many cases, and I think that people are not afraid that the system's going to work. I think it is going to work. It's going to be more expensive in some cases for some states to be involved, but the tests themselves are going to be somewhat different as well.
Okay. Let's again switch gears a little bit, and this is probably for you, Geoff, because you had mentioned business model before. So the question is, in regards to business model formulation, is there anyone you know that is or has built a business model based on successful student outcomes?
Well, I'm sure there are some companies that tell you they have, and it depends on how you measure successful student outcomes. There are some in the past that have said you don't pay for our product unless the kids are successful based upon these following tests. So I'm going to kind of plead the fifth on that. I'm not sure how widespread they are. And you know,
I recall, like you, several companies saying, you know, if this doesn't happen, then exactly you don't pay. But right now, I can't put my finger on who, and I'm not sure that it's being widely touted by anyone right now.
Okay.
It's an interesting idea, but it's the metric is the issue, as Geoff noted.
Yep, that was a bit of a tough one. And this is a very specific one for you, and I'm not sure if you're going to know this off the top of your head, but we'll give it a shot. If you could, one of your earlier slides mentioned the 8 states.
Yeah, I saw that. Guys, I don't know. I've been trying to look it up, but of course, you know, this stuff is scattered all over the Internet. I will find out which ones they are. I'm tempted to say it would be places like California, Hawaii, maybe Illinois, West Virginia, Mississippi, but I can't find the specific reference. I will look it up, and we'll put it in the questions that we send out to you guys when we send you the email that alerts you that we've answered all your questions.
No problem. I knew that was a little tricky, but we'll give it a shot. Who can rattle off 8 states off the top of their head? It was mentioned before about professional development. I think it was you, Geoff, but so the question is about that. Are you seeing trends in professional development also moving into online technology formats?
Oh yeah, there's an enormous amount of professional development online right now, but the uptake on states and districts to me is not as fast as it should be. But I'm not a very patient person. I do think that one of the things we have to overcome is that states and districts thinking that they can do all their own professional development themselves. If they could, because they spend a lot of time and money on that, we would see different results than we're seeing right now in whatever measures you want to have, whether it's graduation rates or test scores. So I think if there's got to be a way that we can help convince them that there are some experts in the private sector who can really, really help them make that happen. And it's a tough sell, I know, but I think it's and online capabilities are among the best. And there's such terrific research out there that shows us that the drive-by workshops that most of the school districts engage in just is not nearly as successful as a lot of the online work that's been done, as well as the community capability to support that kind of a blended learning approach.
Agreed, and the teachers hate it. I mean, teachers complain bitterly about what the district delivers very often at great cost and great effort. But I would agree with Geoff that the uptake, there's a lot of it around, the uptake has been slow. When we ask what they use most at the district level and what they find most successful, I'm not sure what metrics they're using for that last part of the question. The districts tell us that they have moved a lot of their professional development to professional learning communities and professional learning networks. That's good news and bad news. A well-run professional learning community can be an enormously good way to learn a whole lot of stuff, and a badly organized one is probably pretty painful to have to sit through weekly or monthly or however often they meet. So, there are opportunities there for support activities that you guys might build and put on your websites that teachers could pull off and take with them to their PLCs and say, hey, I saw this, it looks good, do we want to try that? That kind of thing.
Okay, good points on the professional development. Yeah, we see a lot of the online, but we also see some strong preference for face-to-face, but that's with a big price tag too, right? Here's a good question. This has popped up before, but with established textbooks on the decline, does it become more difficult to guarantee that information is credible and authoritative? So we get to quality question there.
Well, yeah, and the quality question is really interesting to me, and the cynical side of me, and one who was intimately involved at the textbook process in Texas, managing it, and in some cases trying to change it, and watching it. The best free theater in all of Texas is the textbook hearings. The method that we have of assuring quality right now is just not that effective. It falls apart in a number of ways. Its rigidity, I think, makes it very difficult for any changes to take place. If the content is digital and there is something that's incorrect in there, it can be fixed. If the licensing is flexible, like a Creative Commons license, it also can be fixed and changed and is encouraged to do that. So I guess I'm much less worried about the quality of materials that's out there, especially compared to the current quality process that we go through, and the opportunity costs that we have in not having a much more flexible way to look at the content.
I agree. I think the bigger challenge, or one of the challenges that I see emerging, is that when the districts talk about doing their own, or even when they're talking about looking at materials, they're increasingly interested in modular approaches, and I think it will end up being a challenge in the end for every teacher to manage her classroom using a lot of modular materials that, slip in at the right point, but does she know what the right point is, and is she able to control all of that, So I don't think the quality, remember, beyond fifth grade, the kids themselves are great vetters of the accuracy of something. They've learned how to look stuff up and say, hey, that's not right, that's not the year it happened, or whatever it might be. So I would agree. I don't think the quality is going to suffer that badly. I think there are other issues, though, that will have to be addressed.
And if I can, and you brought up a really good point about sequencing and so on. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that the textbooks that we have right now do a really good job of is there's a lot of research and behind the sequencing, especially in the earlier grades, mm-hmm. and looking at more of a curriculum approach. Whereas if you take the much more modular approach, you end up having the teachers creating the curriculum, and that can be a problem for some teachers. They don't have the time or the expertise to do that to some degree. So there certainly has to be some guidance in how all those chunks are put together, and some support from the school districts. And I think that's an area of the business model that I think different companies could help provide as well. Is we will help you create curriculum, and you tell us what some of the content is that you want to be sure to use, and we'll help you to create that curriculum. So I think there are a variety of ways to address that problem. The quality of the individual resources is going to be largely dependent upon how well those resources are used and how well they match what the students need at that time. But the overall structure of the entire sequence of events, so to speak, is a tougher problem.
Right, especially for elementary school teachers who teach at K-5 every subject, and if you have to create the curriculum for every subject, that's an enormous amount of work. the high school teacher is supposedly an expert in, let's say, history, and that probably is less of a challenge. But there are challenges out there. But there's also great opportunity, as Jess just said.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because we're almost out of time here, literally another minute or two, but I thought we got one question, which is probably a good last wrap-up. We did get a few others, so we will be following up, as I mentioned before. But here's the question. It seems everyone is citing Common Core as part of their marketing pitch. Any ideas how companies can meaningfully differentiate? $64,000 question. Have you seen anything that really resonates with you?
Well, this is a hard one because everything does now say Common Core aligned, and I have argued for a while now that the districts have been very reluctant to accept that. Now, there's two things going on, one of which is they truly do still believe that you just sort of threw your materials in a box and shook them and put them out in a different order. So, if you've really created a program from the ground up, it's not that it's aligned. It's a program that was built to the Common Core. That's a subtle distinction, but it may be one worth really beating the bushes with, that, this isn't realigned. This is ground up, understanding the intent. But it's a hard message to get across. Geoff, have you seen anybody do it well?
Well, no offense to some of our listeners, but I haven't, frankly, and I agree, Ann, that there's a lot of skepticism out there when folks say that we're aligned to the Common Core. And maybe one way to do it is to actually show how, not to say this is one paragraph that's aligned to this standard, but to show something that reflects the Common Core, whether it's an exercise or a module or a lesson plan or something that really does reflect how different the Common Core is, and that's part of the marketing materials. I don't see that as a tagline. I think that's pretty tough, but I think that kind of demonstration is going to be more persuasive than just to assert that we're aligned with the Common Core.
Yeah, a website, a page on your website that says, this was the way this lesson was taught 2 years ago. And to be true to the core, here's the concept, here's the standard, and here is the way we're helping you, suggesting that you might approach it. Could be very valuable. I
think that's great advice, that probably all of our listeners can benefit from, so it's a good way to wrap it up. I do want to take a minute to thank both Geoff and Ann for being with us today, and also say thank you to everyone on the line for your attention and your great participation, especially at the end with all those questions. MDR will be bringing you more value-added webinars very soon. We'll be bringing you some new research on digital marketing in just the next month or so. And just a final note, to please look for our feedback survey in your email. We'd appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to share with us your ideas for future topics. And that wraps up for today. Have a great afternoon. Bye.